The crisp morning air bit at Rick's cheeks as he made his way through Blackwood Forest. 20 years of hunting had taught him the forest's every mood, but today felt different. The usual chorus of birdsong was oddly muted, and even the wind seemed to whisper secrets through the bare branches above. Rick adjusted his orange safety vest and checked his rifle strap for the 100th time. Old habits die hard. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky in soft pinks and purples that filtered through the trees. Fresh snow from last night's storm blanketed the ground, making it perfect for tracking. As he walked, his boots left deep prints in the pristine white surface, each crunch echoing in the unusual stillness. Finally, he muttered, spotting fresh deer tracks crossing his path. The prints were clear and deep, probably no more than an hour old. Rick smiled to himself, feeling that familiar spark of excitement that had never dulled over his 2 decades of hunting. He started following the tracks, moving slowly and deliberately, careful not to make any unnecessary noise. The trail led him deeper into the forest, past the old logging road he usually used as his boundary marker. Something tugged at the back of his mind, a feeling that he should turn back, stick to familiar territory. But the tracks were too promising to ignore. The deer seemed to be heading toward the heart of the forest, where the trees grew older and closer together. After about 20 minutes of careful tracking, Rick came to a small clearing. In the center stood an enormous oak tree, its twisted trunk wider than any he'd seen in these woods. The deer tracks circled the tree and then disappeared, as if the animal had simply vanished into thin air. Rick frowned, scanning the ground carefully. That's when he noticed something odd near the base of the ancient oak. At first, he thought it was just another rock poking through the snow. But rocks don't usually have perfectly straight edges. Rick set his rifle carefully against a nearby tree and approached the oak. Kneeling down, he brushed away the snow with his gloved hand. His heart skipped a beat as more of the object came into view. It was a box about the size of a shoebox, made of what looked like tarnished metal. Parts of it were buried in the frozen ground, but what he could see was covered in strange markings, symbols he'd never encountered before. They seemed to catch the early morning light in impossible ways, sometimes appearing to shift and move when he wasn't looking directly at them. "What in the world?" Rick whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He reached out to touch one of the symbols and quickly pulled his hand back. The metal wasn't cold like it should have been after a snowy night. Instead, it felt warm, almost alive under his fingers. Rick sat back on his heels, thoughts racing. He'd found odd things in these woods before. Old camping equipment, lost phones, even a wallet once that he'd returned to its grateful owner. But this was different. Everything about this box felt wrong, yet he couldn't take his eyes off it. The smart thing would be to leave it alone. Maybe call the local historical society or the university archaeology department. His wife always said he had a habit of sticking his nose where it didn't belong. But as he stared at the box, the symbols seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat, and he felt an overwhelming urge to know what was inside. Using his hunting knife, Rick carefully dug around the edges of the box. The ground was frozen solid, making progress slow, but he barely noticed the time passing. The forest around him had grown even quieter, if that was possible. No birds, no squirrels, not even the sound of wind in the trees. Just his own breathing and the scrape of his knife against frozen earth. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, Rick managed to work the box free. It was heavier than he expected, and the warmth of the metal seemed to seep through his gloves. The symbols were even more striking now that he could see the whole box. They'd formed intricate patterns that somehow hurt his eyes if he tried to follow them too closely. Standing up, Rick brushed the dirt and snow from his knees. He knew he should just put the box back and walk away. He had a deer to track, after all. That's what he'd come out here for. But as he stood in that silent clearing, holding the warm, strange box, hunting was the furthest thing from his mind. The sun had risen fully now, but the day felt darker somehow. Rick looked up at the ancient oak tree, its bare branches reaching toward the gray sky like gnarled fingers. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw something move among those branches, a shadow that didn't quite match any of the others. Making his decision, Rick tucked the box into his backpack. Its weight felt wrong against his back, and those symbols seemed to burn through the fabric. He retrieved his rifle and took one last look at the clearing. The deer tracks were already filling with fresh snow, as if nature itself was trying to erase any evidence of what had led him here. As Rick started the long walk back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone anymore. Every few steps, he found himself looking over his shoulder, but the forest remained empty and silent. Only now, that silence felt less like peace and more like holding breath, as if the entire forest was waiting to see what he would do next. The drive home felt longer than usual. Rick kept glancing at his backpack in the passenger seat, where the strange box sat silent, but somehow still demanding his attention. Every bump in the road made him wince, imagining the ancient metal getting scratched or dented. He'd wrapped it in his spare hunting jacket, but that didn't feel like enough protection for something that might be historically significant. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the winter sun was already setting. His wife's car was parked in its usual spot. She must have finished a shift at the local museum early today. Rick sat in his truck for a moment, engine idling, heat blasting. He should probably tell someone official about his discovery, but the thought of handing over the box made his stomach twist uncomfortably. "You're being ridiculous," he muttered to himself, finally cutting the engine. "It's just an old box." Inside, the house was warm and smelled like fresh coffee. His wife Annie was at her desk in the living room, surrounded by open books and scattered papers. She looked up as he entered, pushing her reading glasses onto her forehead. "No luck with the deer?" she asked, then frowned when she saw his expression. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Rick set his backpack down carefully on the kitchen counter. Not a ghost, but definitely something strange. He unwrapped the box, watching Annie's face as she caught sight of it. Her eyes widened, and she was out of her chair in an instant. "Where did you find this?" she asked, reaching for it automatically before pulling her hand back. Rick noticed she had the same instinct he did, to touch it but also to hesitate. Out past the old logging road, by this massive oak tree. He described the clearing and how he'd found the box. As he talked, Annie circled the counter, studying the symbols from every angle. Her excitement was visible. This was exactly the kind of thing she lived for as a museum curator. "These markings," she murmured, leaning closer. "I've never seen anything quite like them, but some of them remind me of symbols from the native tribes that used to live in this area." She hurried back to her desk and returned with a thick book, flipping through the pages. "See here? This circular pattern is similar to ones found on artifacts from the pre-colonial period, but these are the symbols. They're different, more complex somehow." As if responding to their attention, the markings seemed to pulse more intensely. The runes' shadows deepened, though neither of them noticed at first, too absorbed in their discovery. "Should we call someone?" Rick asked, but his voice lacked conviction. "The university maybe, or the historical society." Annie bit her lip, a habit she had when deep in thought. "We should. That would be the responsible thing to do." She ran her finger along the edge of the box, just above but not quite touching the metal. "But maybe we could study it a bit first, just to document everything properly before we hand it over." A loud thump from upstairs made them both jump. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, but they lived alone and they didn't have any pets. They shared a quick look before Rick headed toward the stairs. The sound had come from their spare room, which Annie used for storage of overflow books and research materials. Rick opened the door slowly, flicking on the light. Nothing seemed out of place at first, until he noticed one of Annie's heaviest reference books lying in the middle of the floor, at least 6 feet from the bookshelf it belonged on. "That's odd," Annie said from behind him. "I'd always make sure the books are pushed back properly. They can't just fall like that." Rick picked up the book and froze. It had fallen open to a page about local folklore, specifically about objects of power that the native tribes believed could trap spirits. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he heard a faint humming coming from downstairs, from the direction of the box. Back in the kitchen, the symbols were definitely glowing now, a soft bluish light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The warmth Rick had felt earlier had intensified. Standing next to the counter, it felt like being near a space heater. "Annie," he said slowly, "maybe we should put it back. Take it back to where I found it." But even as he said it, he knew they wouldn't. The box had awakened something in both of them, a curiosity that bordered on obsession. Annie was already taking photos with her phone, making notes about the patterns, completely absorbed. As night fell outside their windows, neither of them noticed how the box's pulse had begun to match their own heartbeats, or how the shadows in the corners of their home had started to move in ways that shadows shouldn't. They were too busy making plans to study their discovery, unaware that they weren't the ones doing the studying. The only sound from outside was the wind picking up, whistling through the trees in a way that almost sounded like words, like a warning that came too late. Morning came too quickly, though neither Rick nor Annie had slept much. They'd spent most of the night researching, with Annie pulling out every book she had on local history, while Rick searched through old newspaper archives on his laptop. The box sat between them on the kitchen table, its strange warmth now feeling almost normal. "Look at this," Annie said, turning her laptop screen toward Rick. "I found something in the town's digital archives. In 1879, a logger named Thomas Wilson disappeared near Blackwood Forest. The article says he was last seen heading toward—" She paused for effect. "The old oak tree." Rick leaned forward, coffee cup forgotten in his hand. "Could be a coincidence." "Maybe, but there's more." Annie's fingers flew across the keyboard. 1923, a botanist studying native plants. 1956, 2 hikers. 1988, a nature photographer. All of them disappeared in the same area, all near that oak tree. And those are just the ones that made the papers. The morning sunlight streaming through their kitchen window dimmed suddenly, as if a cloud had passed overhead. But when Rick glanced outside, the sky was clear blue. "That's not even the strangest part," Annie continued, too focused on her research to notice. "Each disappearance happened during the week of a full moon. And guess what's coming up in 3 days?" A chill ran down Rick's spine despite the box's warmth. He was about to respond when his phone buzzed, a text from Pete, the local diner owner. "Hey, you might want to see this. Something weird going on in town." Attached was a photo of the diner's front window. Pressed against the glass were dozens of birds, crows, sparrows, even a few hawks, all perfectly still, all facing inward, as if watching the customers eat their breakfast. "Annie," Rick said quietly, showing her the photo. She looked up from her research, and her eyes widened. "That's not normal." She glanced at the box, then back at the photo. "You don't think?" Before she could finish, her phone rang. It was Linda from the museum, her voice shaking slightly. "Annie, I know it's your day off, but could you come in? Some of our Native American artifacts are, well, they're humming and glowing. And I swear they're moving when no one's looking at them." Rick and Annie shared a look. The box's symbols pulsed steadily, like a beacon calling out to something, or like something responding. "I'll be right there," Annie said into the phone. To Rick, she added, "We need to figure out what's going on. Fast." At the museum, they found Linda pacing outside the Native American exhibit. Her usually neat gray hair was disheveled, as if she'd been running her hands through it repeatedly. Inside the display cases, arrowheads, pottery shards, and ceremonial items all had a faint blue glow, the same color as the box's markings. "It started early this morning," Linda explained, wringing her hands. "First just a slight vibration, then the humming, and now—" She gestured helplessly at a display of ceremonial masks. As they watched, one of the masks slowly turned, all on its own, until it faced the exit. Annie pulled out her phone and started recording, her hands trembling slightly. "This is incredible. Rick, look at this pattern." She pointed to a small clay pot. "The symbols appearing on it, they're just like the ones on the box." Rick stepped closer to the display case. She was right. Faint markings were appearing on the artifacts, burning themselves into the surface like brands. He recognized some of them from their late-night research, symbols of warning, of containment, of power barely held in check. A deep rumble shook the building, making the display cases rattle. Outside, those strange gathered birds took flight all at once, their wings darkening the sky for a moment. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the cold air. "We should get back home," Rick said, taking Annie's arm gently. "Linda, you might want to close the museum for today." On the drive home, they passed more unsettling sights. Every dog in the neighborhood was barking, straining at their leashes, all facing the direction of Blackwood Forest. The trees along the road seemed to bend inward as they passed, despite there being no wind. And in their rearview mirror, storm clouds were gathering over the museum, even though the weather forecast had predicted clear skies all week. Back at home, they found their front door standing open, though they were both certain they'd locked it. Inside, all their research papers had been scattered across the floor. But they weren't random anymore. The pages had arranged themselves in a perfect spiral pattern leading to the box. "Rick," Annie said softly, picking up one of the papers, "look at the dates again. The disappearances, the full moons, they're not just connected. They're a pattern. A cycle. And if I'm reading this right," she swallowed hard, "whatever's been sleeping in Blackwood Forest is waking up. And I think we just brought its alarm clock into our house." The box's pulse quickened, matching their racing hearts, as if confirming Annie's words. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying what sounded like whispers in a language no living person had spoken for centuries. The knock at their door came just as the sun was setting. 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo through the house with unusual weight. Rick and Annie exchanged glances. They weren't expecting anyone, and after the day's events, every unexpected thing felt like a potential threat. Rick opened the door to find an elderly woman standing on their porch. Her silver hair was tied back in a long braid, and she wore a warm leather jacket decorated with traditional Native American beadwork. Despite her age, she stood straight and tall, her dark eyes sharp and alert. "I am Rose Whitecloud," she said without preamble. "And you have something that doesn't belong to you." Annie stepped forward. "Please come in." She shot Rick a meaningful look. They'd been hoping someone could help them understand what was happening, and now help had literally shown up at their door. Rose walked directly to the kitchen where the box sat on the table. She didn't seem surprised by its pulsing glow or the way the shadows danced around it. Instead, she sighed deeply, as if confirming something she feared. "My grandmother told me stories about this," she said, carefully sitting down at the table. "Stories passed down through generations about a vessel that holds something ancient and hungry. Something that feeds on human curiosity and desire." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The box's glow intensified, as if responding to Rose's words. "The stories say it was created by our most powerful medicine people centuries ago," Rose continued. "They trapped a dangerous spirit that had been luring people into the forest, feeding on their life force. The box was never meant to be found. The markings," she gestured to the pulsing symbols, "they're a seal, keeping the spirit contained. But they're weakening now." Rick cleared his throat. "We've been seeing strange things. The birds in town, the artifacts at the museum. It's reaching out," Rose nodded, "calling to anything connected to the old ways. The more attention it gets, the stronger it becomes." She fixed them both with a stern look. "You've been studying it, haven't you? Taking pictures? Making notes?" Annie glanced guiltily at her research spread across the counter. "We're both naturally curious people. I work at the museum, and this kind of discovery is exactly what it wants," Rose interrupted. "This spirit feeds on obsession. The more you study it, the more it pulls you in. Haven't you noticed how hard it is to think about anything else since you found it?" Rick realized with a start that she was right. He hadn't thought about work, hadn't called his brother back, hadn't even felt hungry since finding the box. All he'd wanted to do was understand its mysteries. A loud crash from upstairs made them all jump. Rose didn't seem surprised. "It's getting stronger," she said grimly. "The full moon is coming, and the seal is breaking down. Soon it will be strong enough to take physical form again." "What happens then?" Annie asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "According to the stories, it will seek out those who awakened it first." Rose's eyes flicked between Rick and Annie. "It will feed on your curiosity, your knowledge, your life force, everything that makes you who you are. Then it will move on to others, growing stronger with each victim." Another crash upstairs, followed by the sound of breaking glass. The lights flickered, and the box's glow pulsed faster, almost frantically. "We have to take it back," Rick said. "Back to the oak tree." Rose shook her head. "It's not that simple anymore. The original seal is failing. Simply returning it won't be enough. It needs to be bound again, properly, with the old ways." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I've been preparing for this possibility my whole life, carrying on the knowledge passed down through my family." "You can help us seal it again?" Annie asked hopefully. "I can try," Rose said, "but I'll need your help." The spirit has already formed a connection with you both. That makes you vulnerable, but it also gives you power over it. She opened the pouch, revealing herbs, crystals, and what looked like very old bone beads. We'll need to work quickly, though. The full moon is in 2 days, and if we don't seal it by then, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The growing chaos in their house, the strange events in town, it was clear things would only get worse. The box pulsed again, and this time they all heard it, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking in a language that felt ancient and wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, taking shapes that made their eyes hurt if they looked too long. Time is shorter than I thought, Rose said, standing up. We need to gather what we need and prepare the ritual. Tonight. She looked at them both seriously. But I have to warn you, this will be dangerous. The spirit won't go quietly, and it will use everything it knows about you against you. Are you prepared for that? Rick took Annie's hand, feeling her squeeze back tightly. They both knew they didn't really have a choice. They'd started this by bringing the box home, and now they had to finish it. Tell us what we need to do, Rick said, as the whispers grew louder and the shadows continued to dance. Preparing for the ritual was like getting ready for a storm you could already see on the horizon. Rose had sent Rick and Annie to gather specific items while she worked on preparing the box for transport. The list seemed strange but purposeful: pure water from a running stream, oak leaves from trees other than the ancient one, and red clay from the riverbank. Don't let the items touch each other, Rose had warned. And whatever you hear or see while you're out there, don't split up. Now, driving through the darkening evening, Rick kept glancing at Annie in the passenger seat. She held a canvas bag with their collected items, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. The car's electronics had started acting strange, the radio switching stations on its own, the temperature gauge swinging wildly between hot and cold. The whole town feels different, Annie said softly, looking out the window. The streets were unusually empty for early evening. Through windows, they could see families huddled inside, their faces lit by the blue glow of TV screens. Every now and then, they'd spot someone's pet pressing against a window, watching their car pass with 2 intelligent eyes. As they turned onto their street, all the streetlights went dark at once. Their headlights caught something moving in the shadows between houses, something too tall and fluid to be human. Rick pressed the accelerator a little harder. That house looked wrong when they pulled up. All the windows were dark, even though they'd left Rose inside with the lights on. The porch steps creaked under their feet with sounds that seemed to form words just on the edge of understanding. Inside, they found Rose in the kitchen, surrounded by a circle of salt and crushed herbs. The box sat in the center, its glow now so bright it hurt to look at directly. The shadows around it moved like smoke, occasionally taking shapes that disappeared when you tried to focus on them. Good, you're back, Rose said, her voice tight with tension. We need to hurry. It's getting stronger faster than I expected. She gestured to the items they'd collected. Bring them here, but don't break the circle. As Annie carefully handed over their gathered materials, a framed photo suddenly flew off the wall, shattering against the floor. In the broken glass, they could see reflections of things that weren't in the room. It's trying to distract us, Rose said calmly, mixing the stream water with the red clay. Whatever happens, focus on what's real. It will try to show you things, make you hear things. Trust your heart, not your eyes. The house creaked and groaned around them like it was settling into new and impossible angles. The temperature dropped until they could see their breath, then rose until sweat beaded on their foreheads. Through it all, Rose worked steadily, painting symbols on the box with her mixture while chanting softly in her native language. Rick felt something brush against his shoulder and turned to find nothing there. But in the corner of his eye, he kept seeing movements, like people walking through the walls. Annie gasped beside him. All their research papers were floating now, swirling around the room in a complex dance. You're so curious, a voice whispered, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. So many questions. I can show you answers. All the answers. The voice was beautiful and terrible, promising knowledge beyond imagination. Rick felt himself taking a step forward before Annie grabbed his arm. Don't listen, she said, her voice shaking but determined. Remember what Rose said, it feeds on curiosity. The lights flickered wildly, and in the strobing effect, they saw something horrible. Their kitchen had become transparent, revealing layers of time stacked on top of each other. They could see every person who had ever stood in this spot. Native Americans from centuries ago, settlers building the first houses, families coming and going, all existing at once in a dizzying overlay of history. Almost ready, Rose called out, her voice seeming to come from very far away. When I finish the last symbol, everything's going to. The box exploded with light. The salt circle shattered as if hit by a physical force. Rose was thrown backward, catching herself on the counter. In the center of the kitchen, where the box had been, a column of darkness rose up, taking shape like ink dropped in water. So close, the darkness spoke, its voice clearer now, rich with amusement and hunger. But I've had days to feed on your curiosity, your desire for knowledge. I'm stronger now than I've been in centuries. Thunder rolled across the sky as Rick, Annie, and Rose ran toward Rick's truck. The shadow creature's laughter echoed through the streets, making nearby house lights flicker and car alarms wail. Rose clutched the box tightly, its glow now dim and erratic. We have to get to the oak tree, Rose shouted over the wind. It's our only chance to seal it again. They piled into Rick's truck, the engine roaring to life just as a wave of darkness swept down the street behind them. In the rearview mirror, Rick could see the shadow entity flowing like oil across the pavement, absorbing every light it touched. The old ways still have power, Rose said, working quickly in the passenger seat with what remained of her ritual materials. But we need to reach the sacred ground where it was first bound. The oak tree isn't just a tree, it's a gateway, a place where our world and the spirit world touch. Annie sat in the back, holding onto the box. The symbols, they're almost completely dark now. Rick pressed the accelerator harder, the truck's headlights cutting through the unnatural darkness. The road to Blackwood Forest had never seemed longer. Trees whipped past on either side, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. "Look out!" Annie screamed. A wall of shadows materialized in front of them. Rick yanked the wheel hard, the truck skidding on the wet road. They fishtailed for a heart-stopping moment before he regained control. "It's trying to herd us away from the forest," Rose said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "It knows what we're planning." The entity's voice rippled through the air around them. "Why fight what you truly want? I can feel your desires. Knowledge, understanding, power. I can give you all of it." The truck's dashboard lit up with impossible images, ancient secrets written in light, mysteries of the universe unfolding in the GPS screen. Rick gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing himself to focus on the road. "The right turn," Rose called out. "The old logging road. We need to take it." The truck bounced and rattled as Rick turned sharply onto the unpaved road. The shadow entity screamed in rage, the sound shattering their back window. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it whispers of temptation and threats. "It's weakening," Rose said, noticing how the entity's attempts to stop them were becoming more desperate. "The closer we get to the oak tree, the less power it has over this world." They could see the ancient oak now, its massive shape looming in the headlights. The ground around it seemed to pulse with a faint light, like a heartbeat answering the box's dying glow. Rick slammed on the brakes, the truck sliding to a stop in the muddy ground. "Now what?" "We run," Rose said simply. "Whatever happens, get the box to the tree." They burst from the truck, Rose leading the way with a handful of glowing herbs held high. The shadow entity swirled around them, trying to block their path, but wherever Rose's herbs touched it, the darkness retreated with a hiss. "Keep going," Rose shouted as a tendril of shadow wrapped around her ankle. She stumbled but kept her herbs burning. "I'll hold it back." Rick and Annie ran toward the oak tree, the box growing warmer in Annie's arms. The air felt thick, like running through water. Behind them, they could hear Rose chanting in her native language, her voice strong and clear over the entity's shrieks. 20 feet from the tree. 15. 10. The shadow entity's attacks grew more frenzied. It showed them visions of their deepest wishes. Academic fame for Annie, hunting trophies for Rick, mysteries solved and secrets revealed. Almost there, Annie gasped, clutching the box tighter. 5 feet from the tree, a wall of pure darkness rose up before them. The entity took shape, more solid than they'd seen it before, a shifting mass of shadows with too many eyes and a mouth full of starlight. "Enough," it roared, its voice shaking leaves from the trees. "I will not be bound again." But as it spoke, Rose's chanting reached a crescendo. The ground beneath the oak tree began to glow with ancient symbols, similar to those on the box but much larger. The entity's form wavered as the old magic touched it. "Now," Rose shouted, "place the box against the tree's roots." Annie dove forward, sliding in the mud, and slammed the box against the largest root. The instant it made contact, both the box and the tree erupted with brilliant blue light. The shadow entity howled, its form beginning to unravel. "The words," Rose called out, still fighting to reach them. "You have to speak the words I taught you." Rick and Annie joined hands, their voices shaking but growing stronger as they recited the ancient words Rose had made them memorize. With each syllable, the entity's power seemed to fade, its promises and threats becoming distant whispers. The shadow creature thrashed and fought, but the oak tree's power, combined with Rose's knowledge and Rick and Annie's commitment, was proving too strong. Like smoke caught in a wind, it began to spiral inward, drawn back toward the box that had held it for so long. "No," it whispered, its voice now small and far away. "Please, just a few more secrets, just a few more stories." But it was too late for bargaining. The entity collapsed in on itself, pulled into the box with a sound like 1,000 windows shattering at once. The symbols on the box flared blindingly bright, then settled into a steady, quiet glow. In the sudden silence, they could hear the normal sounds of the forest returning: crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the distant call of an owl. The forest was reclaiming itself, pushing back the unnatural darkness that had threatened to consume it. Dawn was breaking over Blackwood Forest, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the leaves of the ancient oak tree. Rick, Annie, and Rose sat on fallen logs nearby, exhausted but relieved. The box rested securely among the tree's roots, its symbols now glowing with a steady, peaceful light. "The seal is stronger this time," Rose said, her voice tired but satisfied. "Your connection to it, your understanding of its power, it actually helped make the binding more complete. Sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to understand it first." Rick looked at his hands, still dirty from digging the proper resting place for the box among the roots. "Will it stay sealed this time?" Rose nodded, pulling her leather jacket tighter against the morning chill. "The entity feeds on curiosity, but you both chose to turn away from its temptations. That weakened it significantly. And now," she gestured to the intricate symbols they'd carved into the surrounding roots, "these will help protect it, new markings, combining the old ways with the lessons we learned." Annie leaned her head on Rick's shoulder, watching the sunrise. "The whole thing feels like a dream already. But look at the tree, it's different now." She was right. The ancient oak seemed to glow from within, its bark shimmering with traces of the power they'd unleashed. Birds were starting to return, perching in its branches and singing their morning songs as if nothing had happened. "The tree will guard it," Rose said, standing up slowly. "And I'll make sure the knowledge is passed down, so there will always be someone watching, someone ready." She smiled at them. "And now you're part of that tradition too." The drive back to town was quiet, all of them lost in their own thoughts. As they passed through the streets, they could see life returning to normal. People were out walking their dogs, picking up their morning coffee, heading to work. None of them knew how close their world had come to changing forever. At the museum, Linda met them at the door, looking frazzled. "Annie, the strangest thing happened last night. All our artifacts were glowing, and then suddenly everything just went back to normal. Did you figure out what was causing it?" Annie shared a look with Rick and Rose. "Let's just say we solved the mystery," she said carefully. "But I think some mysteries are better left as mysteries." Linda seemed disappointed, but nodded. "Well, whatever happened, things are back to normal now. Though," she hesitated, "some of the artifacts have new markings on them. Beautiful ones. The university researchers are going to have a field day studying them." "Just don't study them too closely," Rose murmured, quiet enough that only Rick and Annie could hear. Back at that house, everything had been restored to its original state. The papers that had turned to dust were back, though now they were blank. The broken window was repaired, the scattered books returned to their shelves. It was as if the entity had erased all traces of its presence. "What do we do now?" Annie asked, looking around their familiar but somehow different home. "We live," Rose said simply. We remember, we stay vigilant, but we live our lives. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 small leather pouches, handing one to each of them. Keep these. They're protected by the same magic we used on the box. If you ever sense something strange in the forest, if you ever feel that pull of unnatural curiosity again, these will help guide you. Rick held his pouch, feeling a gentle warmth similar to but much safer than the box's heat. Thank you, Rose, for everything. Thank you both, she replied. Your courage, your choice to fight against temptation, you've helped protect not just this town, but countless people who might have been drawn in by the entity's promises. As Rose left, Rick and Annie stood in their doorway, watching the morning sun climb higher in the sky. The world looked brighter somehow, more alive, as if their brush with the supernatural had awakened them to the everyday magic that existed all around them. I'll never look at that forest the same way again, Rick said softly. Annie squeezed his hand. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Sometimes the most important mysteries are the ones we choose not to solve. In the distance, they could see Blackwood Forest, its trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. And at its heart, they knew, stood an ancient oak tree, its roots guarding a secret that would stay buried this time, a reminder that some knowledge comes with a price, and some questions are better left unanswered. That evening, as the sun set, Rick and Annie sat on their porch, drinking coffee and watching the stars appear. They had declined several calls from fellow researchers asking about the strange events at the museum. Instead, they talked about simple things, work, family, plans for the weekend. But they kept their leather pouches close, and sometimes, when the wind blew just right, they could hear the distant whisper of leaves in the ancient oak tree, standing guard over its eternal secret.